Imagine you accidentally touch a burning hot stove. In the fraction of a second before you even consciously pull your hand away, your brain has already opened a locked cabinet, pulled out a chemical identical to morphine, and flooded your spinal cord to numb the burn.
Right, it's an instant reaction.
Yeah, you are walking around right now with a fully stocked 24/7 pharmacy inside your skull. And I feel like we spend so much time looking for external fixes, uh, pills, coffees, energy drinks, just to change how we feel, completely overlooking the anatomical machine we already have. It's capable of producing incredibly powerful painkillers and mood-altering chemicals.
It really is a marvel of evolution.
Yeah.
I mean, we aren't just talking about mild background chemicals that give you a slight mood boost.
Mm.
We're talking about endogenous opioids and neurotransmitters that are chemically identical in function to some of the most potent drugs we have.
Mm.
And often, they're vastly superior in precision.
Which is just wild to think about. And that brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to map out how this internal pharmacy actually works, specifically looking at your brain's internal opioid and dopamine networks.
Yeah, the core systems.
Exactly. But we're also going to look at the dark side of this, like how this brilliantly designed system can physically break down and fail you in cases of chronic pain and depression. And maybe most importantly, we're going to explore some groundbreaking neurobiological research on how you can manually hack this system.
Which is the really exciting part.
Right. Specifically, how certain controlled breathing techniques can put you back in the driver's seat of your own neurochemistry.
It's a profound shift in perspective, really.
Yeah.
Going from being a passive passenger in your body to an active operator. To guide us, we're looking at comprehensive neurobiological research on the endogenous opioid system, fMRI studies mapping out the brain's pain networks, the clinical literature on how antidepressants actually work, and a fascinating 2014 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on the Wim Hof method.
Oh, that study is a game changer.
It completely challenged the medical consensus on whether humans could voluntarily control their autonomic nervous system.
So let's jump right into the mechanisms here. To understand how you can eventually control your pain and mood, we first have to understand the chemicals your body is naturally manufacturing. Let's start with the painkillers, endogenous opioids. What exactly are they and, how do they work in the body?
Well, the term endogenous simply means originating from within. Your body manufactures three main families of opioid peptides. Those are beta-endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins.
Okay, so beta-endorphins, enkephalins, dynorphins.
Right. You could think of these as the actual medicine. But to work, this medicine needs to find the right locks in your body to fit into. These locks are your opioid receptors, specifically the mu, delta, and kappa receptors. And they're distributed all throughout your central and peripheral nervous systems.
So they're everywhere, basically.
Pretty much. When you experience severe stress or physical trauma, your body releases these peptides. They bind to those receptors, and they effectively mute the pain signals traveling up to your brain. It provides profound analgesia, which is just a fancy word for pain relief.
But, pain relief usually feels pretty good. It's a relief. It's almost like a high. So how does this pain-killing system connect to the feeling of reward in the brain?
That brings us to the dopaminergic system, specifically the mesolimbic dopamine system. That's your brain's primary reward pathway. People often call dopamine the feel-good hormone, but that's actually a bit of a misconception.
Wait, really? Because you hear that everywhere.
Yeah, it's super common to hear that, but dopamine is actually the molecule of motivation, drive, and the anticipation of a pleasurable reward. It's not just about pleasure itself. To understand how pain relief and reward interact, we need to locate where this is happening. Deep in the middle of your brain, in a region called the midbrain, you have a structure called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA.
Okay, so if we're looking at the brain map, the VTA is essentially the dopamine factory.
Yes, exactly. The VTA manufactures the dopamine and ships it out. And a major destination for those dopamine shipments is a structure located slightly forward in the basal forebrain, called the nucleus accumbens, or NANAC. The nucleus accumbens is your core reward center.
Got it.
So when dopamine from the VTA hits the NADAC, you feel that deep sense of motivation and reward. Your brain basically says, whatever we just did to survive or get this feeling, let's definitely do it again.
Okay, I want to clarify something here because the mechanics of how opioids interact with this factory are really wild. If the VTA is the dopamine factory, it's easy to assume that when your body releases opioids, they just walk into the factory and press a big release dopamine button.
That's the logical assumption, yeah.
Right. But looking at the sources, it's an inhibitory process.
It is, and it's a brilliant piece of biological engineering. Opioids don't actually trigger dopamine production directly. They inhibit a different chemical called GABA, which acts as an inhibitor.
Hold on, so it's a double negative. They aren't pressing the gas pedal to give you dopamine, they are just cutting the brake lines.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it.
Yeah.
Yes. Inside your VTA dopamine factory, you have local neurons that constantly release GABA. GABA is the brake pedal. It keeps your dopamine release slow, steady, and in check, so you aren't walking around constantly overstimulated.
Nobody wants a runaway engine.
Exactly. But those GABA brake neurons are covered in mu-opioid receptors. When your body releases endogenous opioids, or, if a person takes an exogenous opiate drug like morphine, those opioids bind to the GABA neurons and shut them down. By inhibiting the inhibitor, you remove the brakes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this disinhibition causes the VTA neurons to fire rapidly, which just floods the nucleus accumbens with a massive wave of dopamine.
That is so counterintuitive, yet it makes perfect sense for survival. You aren't forcing the system to work harder, you're just removing the restrictions during an emergency.
Yeah.
So let's talk about acute pain. Say you touch that hot stove, or you sprain your ankle running from a threat. Walk us through the exact mechanism of what happens in the brain in that moment.
Well, in that moment of acute pain, the burn or the sprain sends a frantic signal up your spinal cord. That signal hits another critical structure right next to your dopamine factory in the midbrain. The periaqueductal gray, or PEG. You can think of the PEG as the master control room for pain suppression.
A PEG, master control room. Got it.
When the PEG receives this severe threat signal, it activates and sends signals back down, descending neural pathways into your spinal cord. Specifically, it releases enkephalins right at the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. These enkephalins literally close the physiological gates on the nerve fibers, blocking the incoming pain signals from ever reaching your brain's conscious awareness.
So it numbs the burn just enough so you aren't paralyzed by agony, allowing you to actually state the immediate danger.
Right. And while the PEG is gating the pain, other regions are logging the event. Your amygdala, which is situated in the temporal lobe, modulates your emotional response in fear. It makes sure you were sufficiently terrified of the hot stove.
Like, do not touch that again.
Exactly. Meanwhile, your hippocampus, right next to it, is forming the contextual memory. It's logging, I was in the kitchen, I touched the front left burner, it was hot. So your brain doesn't just manage the pain. It wires a system to ensure you never make that mistake again.
Okay, so acute pain is essentially a functioning smoke alarm. It alerts you to a real fire, your brain manages the pain so you can escape, and once you're safe and the burn heals, the alarm turns off. The brakes go back on the dopamine factory.
Right, the system resets.
But if this system is so perfectly designed to kill pain and reward us for surviving, why does it fail so miserably when pain becomes chronic?
Well, if acute pain is a functioning smoke alarm alerting you to a real fire, chronic pain is a fundamentally broken system. We want to train the smoke alarm to not sound just because the bacon is burned.
Exactly. You don't want the whole house panicking over bacon.
Right. But in chronic pain, the alarm gets physically stuck in the on position. It rings constantly for weeks, months, or even years. This creates what neurobiologists call a high allostatic load.
An allostatic load is essentially the physical wear and tear that constant stress puts on the body, right?
Yes, and that wear and tear literally changes the physical wiring of your brain. Remember how we said the VTA ships dopamine to the nucleus accumbens to make you feel good?
Yeah, the dopamine factory shipments.
Well, the VTA isn't just one homogeneous blob. It has different sectors. Chronic pain specifically impacts the dopaminergic neurons in the medial part of the VTA.
And this is where the research gets deeply unsettling, because usually dopamine neurons fire when something good happens. But what happens to these specific neurons during chronic, unrelenting pain?
The constant barrage of pain signals from the sensitized spinal cord actually alters the synaptic plasticity of these neurons. Instead of firing in response to a reward, these medial VTA neurons actually flip their polarity. They become excited by aversive, painful stimuli. Your reward circuitry gets hijacked by the pain.
Wait, so the very neurons meant to give you drive and joy are instead being triggered by your suffering?
Unfortunately, yes.
That has to completely exhaust the system.
It drains it entirely. The baseline dopamine levels in your brain plummet. The capacity of your VTA to respond to normal, positive rewards diminishes to almost zero. This is why chronic pain doesn't just hurt physically. It causes profound anhedonia.
Anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure.
Exactly. You lose the ability to derive pleasure from natural rewards like eating a good meal, seeing a friend, or engaging in a hobby.
Which brings us to a really crucial realization for anyone dealing with this. The hidden cost of that false alarm ringing for months on end is that it literally bankrupts your brain's chemical reserves. And when you run out of dopamine, you don't just feel pain, you stop feeling anything.
It's a heavy toll.
Which leads us directly into the root mechanism of clinical depression. Depression isn't just a mindset, it's a physical depletion of these exact chemicals.
It is a severe biological deficit. When your dopamine factory is exhausted, the nucleus accumbens isn't getting its shipments. Subjectively, this means you feel deeply tired, completely unmotivated, and incapable of joy. The reward circuit is offline. But it isn't just dopamine that crashes during chronic stress and depression. Another major neurotransmitter is depleted, norepinephrine.
Also known as noradrenaline, right? Where does that come from?
Norepinephrine is primarily manufactured in a tiny brainstem region called the locus coeruleus. If dopamine is your motivation, norepinephrine is your basic alertness, your wakefulness, and your ability to focus.
So it's the pay attention chemical.
Yeah. When chronic stress exhausts the locus coeruleus, your norepinephrine levels crash. That leads to that profound, heavy lethargy, brain fog, and severe sleep disturbances that are so characteristic of clinical depression.
Man. So put yourself in the shoes of someone experiencing this. You have no dopamine, so you have zero drive or joy. You have no norepinephrine, so you have no energy or ability to focus. You are chemically trapped in a drained body.
It's incredibly debilitating.
And this is exactly where modern medicine attempts to step in with antidepressants. But a terminology around these drugs is incredibly confusing. Let's talk about the mechanics of reuptake inhibitors. How do they actually try to fix this drained system?
Well, to understand a reuptake inhibitor, you need to look at how two neurons communicate. Imagine the dopamine factory again. When one neuron wants to send a signal, it releases chemicals like dopamine or serotonin into a microscopic gap between the neurons called the synapse.
Okay, the synaptic gap.
Once the receiving neuron gets the message, the first neuron acts like a cleanup crew. It sweeps those chemicals off the factory floor, sucking them back inside to be recycled for later. That cleanup and recycling process is called reuptake.
Okay, so if you take a reuptake inhibitor, you're basically firing the cleanup crew.
Exactly. You are blocking the reabsorption. Because the cleanup crew is fired, those neurotransmitters stay out on the factory floor in the synaptic gap much longer. They continue to bounce around and stimulate the receiving neuron, artificially amplifying the signal of whatever tiny amount of chemical you still have left.
That's a great way to picture it. And there are different types of inhibitors depending on which specific factory floor you're targeting. I mean, most people have heard of SSRIs.
Yes, SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They specifically target the cleanup crews for serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that modulates mood stability, sleep, and appetite. By keeping more serotonin active, they help raise the baseline mood.
But the sources also highlight a completely different class of medication, NDRIs, norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibitors, drugs like bupropion, commonly known as Wellbutrin. Why would a doctor prescribe an NDRI instead of an SSRI?
It comes down to identifying the specific broken machinery of the patient's exhaustion. If a patient is presenting with profound lethargy, a total lack of motivation, and anhedonia, that points directly to a depleted dopamine and norepinephrine supply.
So an SSRI wouldn't hit the right target for them.
Exactly. An NDRI fires the cleanup crews specifically for those two chemicals. It leaves more dopamine and norepinephrine active in the synapses to combat that deep tiredness. It essentially jumpstarts the motivation and wakefulness systems without directly acting on serotonin.
It's incredibly precise, and medication is a vital and valid path for addressing this, but it brings up a fascinating question. What if you didn't need a pill to fire the cleanup crew, or to cut the brake lines on your dopamine factory? What if you could manually trigger these exact neurochemical pathways using only your own body?
For a long time, the medical consensus said that was impossible. The autonomic nervous system, the system controlling your heart rate, immune response, and baseline neurochemistry, was believed to be entirely automatic. It was considered beyond conscious, top-down control.
Right, like you can't just sit in a chair and think your way into releasing more endogenous opioids, or at least that's what we thought, until we get to this 2014 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Let's dive into the Wim Hof method, or WHM, because this study rewrote the textbooks.
The premise of the study was incredibly bold. The researchers took healthy volunteers who had been trained in the Wim Hof method. This method involves a very specific cyclic hyperventilation followed by breath retention combined with cold exposure and mindset training.
Okay.
The researchers placed these trained volunteers, alongside an untrained control group, into beds and injected them with an endotoxin.
And we should clarify for you listening. An endotoxin injection, specifically lipopolysaccharides, is a controlled medical way to trick the body into thinking it has a severe, life-threatening bacterial infection. Normally, this triggers a massive, miserable immune response. You get a raging fever, chills, severe headaches. You basically feel like you've been hit by a truck.
And that is exactly what happened to the control group. But the subjects who were actively practicing the WHM breathing techniques didn't experience that severe malaise.
Wait, they just bypassed the fever and aches entirely.
Pretty much.
Mm.
When the researchers analyzed their blood work, the results were staggering. By voluntarily engaging in this mechanical breathing technique, the subjects manually activated their sympathetic nervous system and completely suppressed the systemic inflammatory response.
Okay, we need to break down the how and why here. Mechanically, what is happening in your blood and brain when you do this intense cyclic hyperventilation? Because earlier we said chronic stress is bad. How does stressing yourself out with hyperventilation suddenly become a superpower?
It's all about the blood chemistry. When you hyperventilate, you are rapidly blowing off carbon dioxide. This drastic reduction in CO2 actually changes the pH of your blood, making it more alkaline. It's a state called respiratory alkalosis.
Okay, so the blood pH shifts.
Right. And your brain monitors this blood chemistry constantly. When it senses this sudden, extreme shift, it interprets it as a massive survival threat. It triggers an acute sympathetic nervous system override.
So you are intentionally tricking your brain into a fight-or-flight response.
Yes, your adrenal glands dump a massive spike of adrenaline or epinephrine into your bloodstream. But here's the critical difference between this and chronic stress. This breathing spikes adrenaline without spiking cortisol.
Oh. And cortisol is the bad guy for chronic stress.
Exactly. Cortisol is the hormone responsible for the long-term wear and tear. With this breathing, you get the acute immune-modulating power of adrenaline without the toxic load of cortisol.
And what does that adrenaline do to the immune system?
It violently suppresses inflammation. The adrenaline spike triggers the release of an anti-inflammatory cytokine called IL-10, while simultaneously crushing the production of pro-inflammatory markers that cause fevers and aches. That's why they didn't get sick from the endotoxin.
That explains the immune side, which is incredible. But what about the pain and mood aspect? How does blowing off carbon dioxide affect the dopamine factory and the pain control room we mapped out earlier?
This is where everything we've discussed connects. The extreme physiological state created by the breathing actively engages the periaqueductal gray, the PEG in your midbrain. As we established, when the PEG activates, it prompts the rapid release of endogenous opioids. It sends those enkephalins down the spinal cord to literally gate and block pain signals.
But there's another chemical release too, right?
Yes. The breathing also triggers the release of endocannabinoids. These are your body's natural version of cannabis. These endocannabinoids cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to CB1 receptors in the emotion and cognition centers of your brain.
So that's where the mood boost comes from.
Yeah, it induces a profound sense of euphoria and calm, often described as the post-ice bath glow, while also acting as a peripheral vasodilator to warm your body.
You are physically flooding your own nervous system with the exact chemicals that get depleted by chronic pain and depression. But if you're triggering a massive survival panic, how do you stay calm? What is happening in the higher thinking areas of the brain?
Well, the fMRI data reveals increased activity in two key cortical areas. First, the insula. The insula handles interoceptive monitoring, which is your conscious awareness of your internal bodily state.
Like feeling your heartbeat or your breathing.
Right. The breathing heavily stimulates the insula, enhancing your profound focus on your internal sensations. Second, it activates the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, which handles affective regulation.
So the ACC is what allows you to look at this massive adrenaline dump and say, I'm okay, I'm in control.
Precisely. The ACC provides top-down regulation. It allows your highly evolved conscious mind to override the primitive automatic panic response originating in your brainstem.
Bringing this back to our earlier analogy, by consciously engaging in this deep rhythmic breathing, you are deliberately exposing your brain to a controlled stressor. You are purposely lighting a tiny, manageable fire in the kitchen and using your higher brain to prove that you can easily put it out.
Exactly.
You are teaching your nervous system to recalibrate. You are training the smoke alarm to realize it doesn't need to scream just because the bacon is burned.
That is exactly the mechanism of neuroplasticity at play. You are training resilience. By repeatedly activating these pathways in a safe, controlled environment, you actually strengthen your brain's physical ability to efficiently release dopamine, opioids, and anti-inflammatory markers when you actually need them in the real world. You reverse the exhaustion.
This is such a massive paradigm shift. I mean, we've gone from looking at the deep, mysterious midbrain structures, the VTA making dopamine, the PEG suppressing pain, to realizing that the simple mechanical act of changing the speed of your respiration can be used as a deliberate pharmacological intervention.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. You can literally change your blood pH to breathe your way into managing chronic pain and mitigating depressive symptoms.
And that is the ultimate takeaway here. It is a message of profound self-efficacy. In a world where it is so easy to feel like a passive victim, whether to information overload, a stressful job, or even the chemical imbalances in your own neurochemistry, the biological reality shows otherwise.
Yeah, you have the tools built right in.
You literally possess the anatomical machinery to modulate your own immune and nervous systems. You own the pharmacy. You just need to learn how to write your own prescriptions.
Which leaves me with one final, slightly mind-bending thought for you to chew on as we wrap up today's deep dive. If the simple mechanical rhythm of our breathing can essentially hack our brain's opioid and dopamine receptors to rewrite our physical experience of pain and mood, what other autonomic, unconscious processes happening in your body right now might you be able to consciously hijack?
That's the big question.
Right. If breath is the bridge to the nervous system, what else can we cross over to completely change our daily experience of reality?
It's a frontier we are really only just beginning to map out.
Think about that the next time you take a deep breath. Until next time.